A young Sicario, 15 years old. He told me that, his life belonged to Pablo Escobar. He says, I'll die and I'll kill for him.
Or do you just say, hey, I could die, and that's just part of my job?
When he escaped, everybody was happy. It was a feeling of elation because we were going to have another chance. And this time, we made a promise, basically, that we were not going to lose.
Welcome to Game Changers Live from our home studio here at the beautiful campus of FIU, the College of Communications, Architecture, and the Arts. My name is Sergio Tigera, your host, and I have two very special guests on. And this episode is brought to you in partnership with the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, where they are shaping the next generation of leaders through education, research, and community engagement. Be sure to connect with them at gordoninstitute.fiu.edu. So my guests today are Mr. Steve Murphy and Javier Peña, most famously known as the DEA Narcos. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Sergio. Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
Listen, I am a huge fan of obviously the Netflix series. I think that's what really capitalized and made very, very famous this entire story to the nation. But before we get into that, tell me, what was it that got you too interested in the DEA to begin with? And did you ever realize or even think that it would lead you to the biggest manhunt in history?
Well, you know what? Interesting for me, I did not know what DEA was. I was working with the sheriff's office in Laredo, Texas. I started in 1977, going to school during the day, working at nighttime, like a lot of people are doing now. And sheriff's office, I remember 1977, and I was like 19 years old. I was making probably, I think it was like $12,000 a year. So when I saw the announcement on a college bulletin board that DA was hiring at 17,000, I asked
You're
someone,
like, oh, I'm rich now. Yeah, I got it.
But I asked a buddy of mine, what's the DEA? He said, stupid, those are the federal marks. Oh, okay. So I did not know what it was. But then I came on after the sheriff's office career in Laredo, and I only wanted to do a couple of years to see what it was like. And I wanted to go back to the sheriff's office. So I was a lieutenant. I was teaching part-time at the junior college. I had it made, Yeah. So I came on, and, those 2 years turned into 30. So I think I like the career, my job at DEA.
There you go. How about you, Steve?
For me, I started as a uniformed police officer in the booming metropolis of Bluefield, West Virginia.
There you go.
Back then we only had 35 officers, but and I had just turned 19 years old. And the funny thing about that is at that time they provide your uniforms and such, but you had to provide your own weapon and leather gear. I wasn't old enough to buy a gun or bullets, so but I could carry one and arrest people. So did that for 6 years, became a railroad cop for almost 6 years. And I was the same as Javier. I didn't know what DEA was, but there was a railroad police officer I worked with, Pete Ramey, still dear friend, who was a Virginia State Trooper, had worked on a DEA task force out of Roanoke, Virginia. And he's the one that really got me interested. Came on DEA in 1987. First post was Miami here from 1987 to 1991. And if you remember those days, it was still the Wild West here in Miami.
Absolutely. Paradise Lost.
Oh, you know what? I still love Miami. My wife and I, this is our favorite city in the entire United States, believe it or not. And then volunteered to go to Colombia. Didn't know Javier. When you go overseas, with DEA, you have to volunteer. They don't just send you. And I had no idea that I was going to be working on the Pablo Escobar case. It's one of those instances where you get in the embassy, you get to know everybody. Javier had a different partner that I actually got to be friends with, Gary Sheridan, just because we had some common law enforcement contacts in West Virginia. Then Gary got promoted, and I'd already been working with Gary and Javier to a degree, but that's how we got to be partners. And you know what? 3 days after I got in Colombia in 1991 is when Pablo surrendered. And I figured, well, he heard Murphy was in the country. Might as well
That's it. It's done. This was an easy assignment.
That's a joke. So that's how I got involved in it.
So for everyone out there, listening, if you've seen the show or if you haven't seen the show, let me give you some statistics here. So Pablo Escobar was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. He was worth an estimated $30 billion in the 1990s, which today, adjusted for inflation, would be around $64 billion. He carried, he spent $2,500 a month on rubber bands just to hold his stacks of cash together. He would, the Medellin cartel was smuggling approximately 15 tons of cocaine every week. They had cornered the market. They had 80% of the global cocaine market, 90% of the U.S. market. But he was also incredibly violent. They killed an estimated 4,000 people. His sicarios, a private army, at the peak, I think, reached to close to 1,000. And so incredibly violent and incredibly, the largest manhunt in history to go after this guy. But also in Colombia, he was also seen from a different perspective as well, right? Because it wasn't the madman that everyone else in the world thought it would be. He had a bit of a Robin Hood effect. So tell me about what you saw there that made them think that.
Yeah, that Robin Hood, like I said, he was known as that Robin Hood because, he gave money to the poor, built houses, gave a lot of money to the Catholic Church in Medellin. But at the same time, he was responsible for the killing of about 50,000 people, innocent people.
50,000?
50,000.
So I was way short.
Steve and I did our analysis,
wow.
And we put the analysis, we pretty much put a figure of 10 to 15,000 people. Where we get the 50,000 people, one of his favorite sicarios, a guy by the name of Popeye, John Jairo Velázquez Vázquez, was the last remaining sicario, went to jail, did about 20 years. He came out about 5 years ago, and he also, writes a book. He's been on documentaries, but he says that the figure was closer to 50,000 people that Pablo Escobar killed. And I got to mention that Popeye also, he himself credits about 300 killings to him that he killed. And I'm going to say that people have tried to get us on the same stage with Popeye. We said we will never share a stage with Popeye. And he died about 3 years ago. And the Medellin cartel was pretty much wiped out, basically.
Wow.
And talking about him being Robin Hood, he did good things. And I hate to give him credit for anything, but he did give money to poor people. He built housing, free housing for people that lived on the edge of a trash dump. He gave away food. He built medical centers. But there's always a payback. He didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart.
Right.
When he needed new sicarios, where do you think he went to recruit them? He went right back into those barrios, those slums. And the people there loved him because of what he had done for them. So where some people say he's a Robin Hood, we call him a master manipulator because he manipulated all those people. And the sad thing is, he would go in and say, hey, I need 100 people to come and kill for Pablo and die for Pablo. And you might have 400 kids from 13 to 19, 20 years old step up. So he just used those people. So this thing about the Robin Hood, there's nothing Robin Hood about this guy. It was all about him.
Right. And they saw that that's their way to prosperity. That's their way to get out of the slums, to make something for themselves, to make some money. And that was their only choice. Yep. So when you all moved to Colombia, and I know you spent some time in Miami, where you mentioned prior to coming to Miami, you had only seen perhaps a few grams of cocaine, where now then all of a sudden you're into 400 or 500 pounds of cocaine. At what point did you guys realize the depth and magnitude of what Pablo Escobar was doing when you started the case?
Well, basically when Pablo Escobar started, obviously he started. And he started with his first cousin, a guy named Gustavo Gaviria Riveros in Medellin, and they started with small amounts, and that's when the height of the cocaine business in Colombia in the mid-'80s, early '80s was starting to flourish. And by flourish, there were other organizations. So Pablo Escobar, started experimenting, trying a small kilos at a time, and they noticed that this was going to be a very lucrative business. And because of Pablo Escobar's that ingenuity that he had, that violence streak that he had, that leadership, and I got to mention Pablo had leadership skills that, and when you talked about the sicarios, the recruiting sicarios, I mean, he'd go there and he'd hug them. There'd be about 300 young thugs, call them thugs, waiting for him. Hug them, kiss them, give them money, and that's what the allegiance was all about, that working for the boss, Pablo Escobar. And if you started to work for Pablo Escobar at this time, you were going to be somebody in Medellin. And,
respected,
I've always,
have some money.
Yes, and I've always, what something that always fascinates me is the life of a sicario. And I don't think there's been that, because how does a sicario, is he born with it, or does he learn? And you know what? If you look at these thugs, and I remember the first one, I had to get involved in arrest of a young sicario, 15 years old. He told me that, his life belonged to Pablo Escobar. He says, I'll die and I'll kill for him. And you know what the basis was for that Pablo Escobar rescued them from being in poverty. In other words, we were living, he told me, living in cardboard boxes, me and my mother. Pablo picked us up, bought us a house, gave us money. He says, my life belongs to Pablo Escobar. And one thing he also mentioned, he says, you know what, he says, I'm 15 years old. By 21, 22, I'll be dead. But as long as I die working for Pablo Escobar, that's what I want in life.
Wow.
So look at that attitude and you multiply it by 500.
It's almost like a religious fanaticism.
Yes.
Right, to that point.
We're talking about a man who became the world's first narco-terrorist. So what's a narco-terrorist? Basically, it's just a narcotics trafficker that employs terroristic activities in his criminal enterprise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pablo introduced a level of violence that, and if you research the history of Colombia, it has an extremely violent history. I mean, there's even one section of time that they refer to as la violencia, the violent times. And but you got Pablo who comes in and introduces a level of violence that before him there had been violence in the narcotics traffic, but he introduced a whole different level. So when you talk about this guy being charismatic and a leader, well, his leadership skills are, I ask you to do something and you don't, I'll kill you and your family.
Yeah.
Well, that word gets out pretty quick, right? And that's why people feared Pablo, because if he said he was going to kill you, you better run or you better get ready for battle.
And his manner of influencing people is obviously demonstrating the violence. And one of the most famous ones was the Avianca flight, which killed hundreds of innocent lives. And what was that like in Colombia when that came out? Did that turn the tide against him?
Well, there were actually a couple of factors that turned the tide. Avianca, of course, was one. I mean, it was a commercial airline. It was going from Bogota to Cali, 1989. Pablo thought the presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria was going to be on board. And Gaviria at the last minute cancels. He is not on board. That struck Colombia by putting a bomb on a commercial airline. Again, I think it was 107 innocent people were killed on board that airline. But to me, I mean, obviously that is drastic, right? Put a bomb on a commercial airline to kill one person. But to me, and I witnessed it, was what turned the tide is when he killed the presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Galan, 1989. That turned the tide. That caused Colombia to ask the United States for help. That caused Colombia to authorize extradition. And remember, extradition, what was Pablo was fighting all
That was
about.
his biggest fear.
He did not want to get extradited, and it was unconstitutional. So when he kills presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan, the president of Colombia, Barco Vargas, Virgilio Barco Vargas, I'll always remember, says, you know what, I do not care that extradition is unconstitutional. I am authorizing extradition. On his own decree, how does a president, he did it, and that's what actually turned the tide. And that's where most of the Colombians were mad, because they loved Luis Carlos Galan. He was going to be your next president, and you kill your next president. So obviously, the Avianca bombing was critical. The killing of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan, the bombing of the DAS building, 1999, where he was trying to kill General Miguel Maza Marquez, one person who ran the DAS, which was like the local immigration FBI office in Colombia. And then again, all the kidnappings, the assassinations, the bounties on police officers. That's what caused, but if you had to single out one particular event, I would say it was the killing of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan.
Wow. How did you cope with the thought that you had bounties on your heads? How did you sleep at night, and knowing that there's this constant danger to you, to your loved ones, to your families? spouses. You're there for years. Is that something you just get used to, or do you compartmentalize it and say, okay, I'm fine, I'm protected, or do you just say, hey, I could die, and that's just part of my job?
I tell you what, when you first find out that there's a $300,000 price tag on your head, it's a little bit disconcerting, but it's human nature is if you survive things over and over and over again, you become somewhat complacent about it. Mm-hmm. And it's always in the back of your mind, but if you sit around and worry about it, something like that, it'll drive you crazy.
Right.
And it was, it's kind of a sick way to look at it, but you come back to the United States and you're talking to your buddies in DEA and your old friends that know what you're doing, and you just kind of brag about it a little bit, as silly as that sounds. Mm-hmm. But there were a couple of wiretaps where we heard Pablo refer to the two gringos, and that was Javier and I. And then later on, there was an intercept that actually mentioned the names Peña and Murphy.
Wow.
That was probably more disconcerting than knowing that there's a bounty on you. But it's the same token, if you look back to the Kiki Camarena days when he was killed by the Mexican cartels, mm-hmm. and the response of the United States was they shut down the border between the United States and Mexico for a certain amount of time, very short amount of time, a day or two. But if you look at what the traffickers are doing, why are they in the drug business to start with? It's all for the money, right?
Right.
So if they've shut the borders down, they can't get their product up here, they can't get the cash flowing back into South America. They don't want that. So we think that Kiki's legacy had a lot to do with keeping us alive. We never pretend to be tough guys. We're mm-hmm. a couple of small town country boys that got to work a really big case, but we were much younger. We had some extra training and weapons and things like that. And for me, and well, Javier as well, we're both Christians. I believe the good Lord has a plan for all of us. And when it's my time to go, I might be sitting here talking to you on this podcast.
Hopefully not.
Me too. But, and I don't have a morbid view of life.
Right.
It's just I figure when it's time to go, it's time to go.
Right. And so what was the turning point? What was that game-changing moment where you said, okay, now we have the upper hand? Because you're going after different parts in the chain, right?
Yep. And if you go back to the surrender, 1991, the surrender to me was like, what is Colombia doing letting him surrender because of all the innocent people that he killed, all the police officers that he killed, friends of ours that he killed? I remember a lot of personal people that I knew getting killed, and when Colombia said we're going to let him surrender, it was like, what about all the lives, all the Avianca people that were killed on board that airplane, all the 50,000 people? So basically, and I always remember when he surrendered, our attitude was like, basically Pablo Escobar won, and what's going to happen? Nothing. All the people that he killed, all the tragedy.
And he built his own luxury prison, right, with the nightclub and sauna and everything.
He surrendered into his own prison. So basically, we lost. The turning point of all this is the escape, Pablo Escobar, from his so-called prison. When he escaped that night, basically the next day, Steve and I were sent to help out the search block of the Colombian National Police, and everybody was happy. It was a feeling of elation because we were going to have another chance, and this time we made a promise, basically, that we were not going to lose.
Prior to Steve getting there, you were there 3 years prior to that. Tell me about what that time was like.
Yeah, I got there in 1988, and it was an informal task force, not like the one that Steve and I did after the escape. But during that first, I call it the first manhunt for Pablo, it was a learning experience for me because, like I said, I came from Austin, Texas, where we were, doing undercover for small amounts of meth, coke, black tar heroin was big in Austin, Texas. So when I went to Colombia, oh, and by the way, you know what? You know how I got to Colombia? I mean, it was a mistake. I wanted to go to Mexico, and I put in for Mexico, and it was a mistake. So they sent me to Colombia, and my boss says, "You want to fight it?" I said, "Nah, I'll go to Colombia." So I'll never forget 1988. I mean, 1988, and it was basically a learning experience for me, because here you are dealing with some of the major traffickers of the world. You're dealing in tonnage, quantities of cocaine. I remember my first case was 800 kilos of cocaine on a plane on American Airlines going to Miami.
Wow.
And the cocaine was just in boxes, not even hidden, in the belly of the plane.
You're kidding.
I said, like, what? It was just to show the people that these traffickers had at the airport, the
connections everywhere.
Connections everywhere. So it was a learning experience. And when I started working, and I got assigned the case of Pablo Escobar, and then I started going to Medellin, and it was, working with our cops. We had a specialized group of cops. It was like, wow, this is an organization I've never been used to. So started slowly working it, and towards the end, I learned a lot of Pablo Escobar. Remember, 80% of the cocaine was being sent by Pablo Escobar. And if you look at Miami, and I like to correlate the late 80s, early 90s, Miami, remember the movie Scarface?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the movie Blow?
Yeah.
It was just like that going on. And matter of fact, I remember the best. I talked to we had a conference, and there was a doctor in the audience. And after the conference, the doctor says, "You know what, guys? I was a rookie doctor in Miami in the mid '80s, and we had to rent refrigerator trucks to put the bodies of dead Colombians. We could not handle them at our morgues." And you look at the massacres, the Dateland Mall massacre at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and if you look at the Griselda Blanco story, she herself was vicious here in the Miami area, killing a lot of people herself. So it was a Wild Wild West show here in Miami. However, the cocaine was being sent by Pablo Escobar in Colombia.
And when you were in Bogota in the book and DEA Narcos, I remember you saying that you had come home. You have a beautiful apartment in the north part of Bogota, and then you get a phone call.
Yes, I get a call from my boss who says, "Oh, he says, "All right, just don't panic." He says, "Get your gun." He says, we had Broncos, get your Bronco and haul ass to the embassy. Hang up the phone, don't say nothing, just get out of there, look at your surroundings, make sure. So when I get to the embassy, they're all waiting for me. And I said, "What happened?" "Well, we got an intercept that they were coming for you, that they're going to come and kill you at your apartment." And it's beautiful apartments, It was 4-bedroom apartments. This one was on the 17th floor, overlooking the city of Bogota. On one side, the city, then I had the mountain views. I mean, we couldn't live in anywhere like I said in the States on this. So my first experience was to get out of my apartment and head to the embassy because they were coming for me.
Wow. And that happened twice.
That happened twice, yeah. But the U.S. government, all they did was
you just get used to moving around.
Yeah, moving around. All right.
So I have some fans that I asked, okay, what questions do you want me to ask these gentlemen? They submitted some great questions here, so I want to read a couple of these to you. All right, so the first one comes from Dr. Gabriel Deach. He's the owner of D&H National Research Centers. He says, the show Narcos highlights moments where ethical boundaries were tested to capture Escobar. In real life, how did you balance the pressure to bring him down with the need to maintain integrity and uphold international law? Were there moments when the ends justified the means, and how did that impact your approach to future operations?
Well, nothing, the ends can never compromise your integrity.
Right.
We took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. We have zero jurisdiction down there. We're not calling the shots. Mm-hmm. We do have input, and we're supporting the operations. We broke policy, rules, and procedures every day from the embassy and from DEA. Everybody knew we were doing it, but the one thing we never did was break the law. Mm-hmm. So the show shows that we were on helicopters when people were being kicked out the door, that I was kidnapped. I was never kidnapped. Javier passing classified information to Los Pepis. That's Hollywood. None of that is true. And people, one of the most frequently asked questions we get is how much of Narcos is true. Well, there's only about a third of it that's really true.
Wow.
The second third is kind of true. They've really dramatized a lot of what goes on, and that last third is just straight out make believe Hollywood.
Wow.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get is, did they break into my apartment and kill our cat? Well, we did have a cat named Puff, and Puff died in Colombia, but Puff was old. He had a heart attack. The Sicarios didn't break into our apartment.
He had an easy death.
Yeah, so
wasn't tortured.
And like when we go to the United Kingdom, man, in England, they believe if it's on TV, it's gospel. I mean, they believe everything is Steve on TV, and we do a Q&A at the end of every show. This is our 9th year of traveling around the world, and we used to let the audience shout questions up to us on stage, and I mean, they're like, Javier's dirty. Why isn't he in prison?
Oh my gosh.
Well, it's Hollywood. It's make believe, And that's the one thing we learned is that with Hollywood is they'll never let the truth get in the way of telling a good story.
Right.
And if I can say, but you know what? Yeah, that we always get that question. Why were we dirty? But like Steve said, we broke policies, rules. We never broke the law. One thing that we did do is go out on operations. Every time with the cops on search warrants with them. So, and by going out with them, and they wanted you to go out with them, but it was that exchange of intelligence. You cannot, like, for example, I remember finding phone numbers of people in Miami that worked for Pablo Escobar. So we would channel that information right away to Miami, and Miami DEA was doing a great job in going after the Escobar people working in Miami. That's one thing that really helped us, but by dismantling all of the organization. I mean, it was beautiful. Miami would take down Escobar people. We would take them down in Colombia. You're going after all of the organizations, which is what we try to teach to some of our counterparts, how it worked, and I just cannot overstress by us being there. Instead of waiting a month, a week to get that information, you're getting it hot off the press, and you're acting on it. And a lot of it was coming back from Miami to Colombia. I remember some of the information led to the famous warehouse where Pablo kept all his antique cars. We gave him that information. We were following people, Escobar, all over the world. We give them the information when they were calling back too. So by us being there was a big turning point in us, basically going after all of the organization.
Sergio, if you look at intelligence, if you don't act on it when you get it, tomorrow it's not intel, it's history.
Right.
So that was what he said is exactly right. That's what made the difference. And believe it or not, as strange as this might sound, taking down Pablo and the Medellin cartel was the first time that we had completely dismantled an international manufacturing and distribution cocaine organization. And then DEA continued to work with the Colombian National Police and took out the Cali cartel, and then next with the North Valley cartel, and then Don Berna, who had La Oficina de Envigado. It was a model that worked. But it's just strange to say that taking down the Medellin cartel was the first time that we entirely dismantled an entire organization.
Yeah, it was a game changer in U.S. history. And
it was.
That's incredible. And so that leads me to the next one from Lorianne Cox. She's the CEO of Breakthrough Miami. So would it be easier to successfully capture and take down Pablo Escobar today, and why?
That's a great question. You know what? Like you said, if you look at, like I said, all the terrorism, and that's why we call them the inventor of narco-terrorism. You look at the bombing, the Avianca, the DAS, the killing of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan, the killing of newspaper editor Guillermo Cano, who the El Espectador, y'all remember, El Espectador wrote an all-bad piece saying Escobar should be extradited. Escobar kills the editor. Wow. It's a famous editor that everybody loved in Colombia. So this was a different type of a war. It was personal. And it was something, you know, and we said that there was a lot of times towards the end, Steve and I would just say, you know what, let's let this guy surrender. Let's just all go home, man. Go back to our families. We're living with the cops in Medellin. But when he blew up, you know, put the car bombs, police officers getting killed, it's like, you know what, we cannot let him surrender. So it was a different type of a war. And like I said, I always go back. We never crossed that line. Yes, we worked with some city characters. We worked with Don Berna. And if you look at the Narco series, Don Berna was the head of Los Pepes. However, we did not know that at the time. We find out after Pablo Escobar gets killed that Don Berna was the head of Los Pepes, and Don Berna's in jail in the United States right now. He gets extradited. So, yeah, there's a lot of instances. However, like I said, we never crossed the line.
You know, if you look at, I think it would be harder nowadays to capture Pablo simply because of the advancement of technology. You know, with end-to-end encryption on your communication devices,
right, that's
almost
impossible to.
It's almost impossible unless you have some specialized program. And you know, I don't know that the drug war, first of all, is a big misnomer title, but I don't know that you have the commitment of our country to commit those type of resources to go after them.
And so that it's interesting because there's another question here from Juan Diaz, who's a VA surgical nurse, and he talks about the supply of cocaine being as high or higher than before. Is that because, so let me read the question here. So given historical prices showing that the value of cocaine on the street is much lower today than in the 80s, would suggest that the supply of cocaine has not decreased. If anything, is still well supplied. Do you feel our long-time war on drugs started over 50 years ago has been successful, or is it time to find some kind of new approach to it? What are your thoughts on the war on drugs, and has it been successful?
You know, unfortunately, he's exactly correct. You know, we challenge our audiences. Can you go out and buy cocaine on almost any street corner in the United States today? We all know you can, right? But it's also not something that can be ignored. So Javier and I have discussed this at length on other shows and on the stage and different, media groups. We're big proponents of education. If you look at the statistics, the United States is the largest consumer country in the world of illegal narcotics. And so we look at what our lawmakers are doing, and they're making it easier to get access to narcotics in the United States. Why are we making it easier for our citizens to get drugs that will harm them?
Right.
And there's a proven track record. Now they say there's functioning addicts out there. I've never met one. I guess there are. I've never met one. Yeah. And it actually comes down to a personal opinion as well. I think we should stop being so permissive. I think we should enforce. We don't need new laws. The laws are on the books. We don't need law enforcement reform. You know, let the cops do their job. Stop expecting them to do every job that nobody else wants to do. You know, when we went through the academies, we both been through 2 academies. You're trained in law enforcement. I was never trained in how to handle a mental person. You know, it was all the different things. Even going to the domestic disputes, you're only trained very minimally in how to handle those.
All these other.
You're responsible for handling that. And you know, now I know I'm getting on my high horse a little bit here, but we're expecting our law enforcement professionals to do things that they don't know how to handle, and then we want to point the finger at them when things don't go right. So I think that we just become overly permissive in our country to the point where certain states are legalizing heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, not just weed. I'm not in favor of weed being legalized.
Right.
People think that's a cure-all, you know, the end-all to be-all for it's going to raise billions of dollars is what we're talking about in Florida here. Really? Billions of dollars? I mean, some of these things you just have to apply a common sense principle to. Yeah. But, you know, back to the question there, he's absolutely right. But we can't ignore the problem.
Right.
You know, if we did, where would we be? What if it wasn't for all our professional law enforcement personnel out there that are fighting this on a daily basis, that are risking their lives every single day, where would our country be? Yeah. We'd be another third world country is what we'd be.
Right.
And we've talked to a lot of people that are adults now, and a lot of them mention, remember the DARE program that they went to in school? There's like, man, that was a great program. We've talked to other people with like, you know what, all those pictures you would see of the before or after, you know, drug use. He said, I remember when somebody said, you know, that scared me to the point where I said, I don't want to get involved in that. The point I'm trying to make is education, we need more, and I think that's been going down the tube lately on drug education. We need something, more programs, and you're right, it's out there. You can buy dope anywhere. Look at all the problems going on, but again, it's going back to, you know what, we need to start telling, you know, young people the truth of what these drugs are, the consequences.
Right. And so, and fentanyl obviously is now the new cocaine, and even much more dangerous. Much more.
I mean, you know, if you don't view that as an attack on, I don't want to get in politics. We try to stay very apolitical, so I don't want to talk politics. But if you don't view the influx of fentanyl into our country as somebody invading our country, it's a pretty naive opinion to take, in my opinion.
One point of advice I will give everybody is be careful with that medication that your friend will offer you. How many times have we been told by our neighbor, our friend, hey, no, try this pill, it'll help you. There are more consequences. We've talked to many people where that one pill, person never used drugs, could not sleep. They think it's a common prescription for a painkiller, and they bought it on the streets and it was filled with fentanyl. There are thousands of those type of examples. Be careful with that stuff they give you out there. If it comes from your doctor, you're fine. Your pharmacist, you're fine. But it comes from a friend, I've learned now. And, you know, you go back in your lifetime, how many friends have offered you, neighbors, oh, here, take this.
It could be as simple as a Tylenol or an aspirin.
Right, and you didn't even realize it.
It's, you know, before COVID, we worked with another group, Javier and I did, and we went on Capitol Hill twice, once to talk to the House side, once to talk to the Senate side. And then later we went to speak to the American Legislative Exchange Conference, and it was all about counterfeit medications. And this was before fentanyl was really becoming a household word. But of all those politicians and staffers we talked to, I bet you less than 5% knew that counterfeit medications were even an issue in the United States. They would come to you afterwards and ask questions, and they're like, I had no idea.
Wow.
Well, you know, after we informed them of it, we still didn't see any change for years. I mean, over the last year or so, we're losing over 300 people a day to fentanyl poisonings, whatever you want to call it, overdoses, poisonings.
Right.
Doesn't matter. We're losing 300 Americans every single day. So if that's not most serious, what if a jet airline, a commercial airline, crashed every single day? There's not 300 people on those planes.
Right.
What would the reaction be from our government then, or from our populace? But, you know, it's like having that $300,000 bounty on your head. You become complacent, you know, and we just accept it until it directly affects us. Then people want to get serious about it. I wish I had the answer. You know, Javier and I were both big proponents of education. These groups that are out there now, the Faces of Fentanyl and things like that, where they are bringing more awareness to it. If you think that it's not touching your family in some manner, you need to look harder. I just about guarantee you it will.
Absolutely. And so as you look back on your careers, I always, my point of view is I would rather regret something I have done than regret something I haven't done. I always, you know, prefer to, I don't want to look back on in my deathbed and say, oh, I wish I would have tried that. I wish I would have tried this. When you start looking back at your careers, is there anything that you regret from the time that you were there, or you know, saying I should have, you know, taken that chance? Obviously, you guys took the biggest chance of all with your lives, and perhaps you didn't realize what you were getting yourselves into at the time. But is there anything that you look back on and you say, you know, I wish I would have done something different?
Yeah, you know what, my regret, and I don't know, just I wish we would have taken down Pablo Escobar a lot sooner than later.
There's an old saying, Sergio, that says, if you find a job you like, you'll never work a day in your life. We were fortunate enough to find that job. We were both cops for 38 years. I don't want to look that old, but well, we are. But it was, I can't think of anything else I would have rather done.
Yeah. Well, you guys are game changers, absolutely, in your careers and what you've done and the lives that we've saved through the influence of not only yourselves but the Colombian police enforcement, the military, and hopefully we never see somebody like Pablo Escobar again.
Hopefully, and the real heroes were the Colombian National Police search
That's right.
squad, led by Colonel Hugo Martinez and General Octavio Vargas Silva. They're the heroes.
And we've said a lot of bad things about Colombia during this little talk here. It's one of the most beautiful countries in the world.
It is.
The people are some of the
And
nicest
great,
people in the
yes.
world. Other than
It was a different time,
after the United States, that's my favorite country to visit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Great.
telling her that
Yeah, we have great friends there, great people, and we encourage tourism. Go back, visit Colombia,
Yeah.
and it's safe.
Absolutely. I was telling Steve that I used to work for Caterpillar and used to go there once a month for 3 years, and it was
Wow.
fabulous. I mean, just the
It's
people,
still
the
beautiful. Yep, the
and
food,
the safety,
people,
everything.
The scenery. It's just beautiful country.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, gentlemen, on a stellar career. You definitely are game changers. Thank you for being on the show. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you, Sergio. We appreciate you having us.
Yep. Thank you, Sergio.
All right. So if you enjoyed this, make sure to like and subscribe and share it with somebody that needs to hear this, because you could be the game changer in their life.
And go FIU.
And go FIU. Pause up.